guys, this is Smithy. Welcome to my channel. Today's video is a yet another special video. I have been eyeing this palette for such a long time, so I really wanted to create a dupe because you know my struggle. I'm going to keep my collections precise till the time I do not find unique palettes in this market. So let's begin duping. The Ace Beaute is the newest palette, Palettopoly palette. So let me tell you a few details about the palette. This is the Ace Beaute's newest palette and I love the color story of this palette. It is like a chaotic color story, but like the shades really jump out to me. This palette launches on 19th of July and I don't know exactly what price this palette is going to be. It's still not like disclosed on Instagram, but if I see it, I'll link everything in the description box below for you guys. This palette contains 24 beautiful shades. I cannot say like there's like a specific color story to it. There is like pinks, there is purples, there is blues, there is greens. There's so many things to choose from. I have duped the entire palette. I'll give you a close-up on the screen for you guys how all the swatches look in the outside lighting too. And I also created these two looks using the dupe shades that I duped from the palette. So if you're ready, let's begin duping. Let me tell you which all palettes I used to dupe this palette so that you exactly know like what palettes to look forward to. Mainly, if you do have the Glamlite Mikayla palette, the original Mikayla palette, yes, a lot of shades are from this palette. Then I would say if you do have the Mariposa palette from Melt Cosmetics, and I used a few shades from the Age of Opulance palette and the Dirty Martini palette from Glamlite. So I'm going to go row by row duping these shades. So let's begin. Okay, the first shade in the palette is called Vogue, and this is being duped by the shade called Simba from the palette. And this, I would say, it's like a muted pink, but with like a hint of coral in it. So let me swatch that. So this is how the first shade in the palette looks. The second shade in the palette is called As If, and this is being duped by the shade Handy from the palette. And this is a matte stark yellow shade. So let's apply that. And that's how the second shade looks. And if you guys know, you know, like Glamlite Mikayla palette is like one of my favorite colorful palettes in my collection. So I was so happy and I was not amused to see that color story like jumping out to me. The third shade in the palette is called Mullet, and this is being duped by the shade called How You Doin. Let's swatch that. I don't know if I did tell you guys or not, the two eyeshadow looks that you're seeing on my eyes, I have recorded this and I'll put it towards the end of the video for you guys to check it out. The next shade in the palette is called Digital Pet, and this is being duped by the shade called Nube from the Mariposa palette. Again, it's a matte purple shade, like a deep purple shade. And that's how it looks. The next shade in the palette is called Material Girl, and this is being duped by the shade called Glow Up from the Mikayla palette. It's a beautiful, I would say like a rose goldy shade. A beautiful shimmer, like for the inner corners, for the lid shade. It's just a beautiful shimmer shade. The next shade in the palette is called VHS, and this is being duped by the shade called Olive Lover from the Dirty Martini palette. And that's the first row swatched out for you guys. I'll give you guys a close-up of the entire palette once I've swatched all of it together, but I really want to capture it row by row so that you guys can see all the shades very closely and very precisely. Okay, now let's move on to the second row. The first shade in the second row is called Walkman. By the way, I love the shade names that were chosen for this palette. It just reminds me of like 80s generation. I love it. I absolutely love it. And that shade, the Walkman shade, is being duped by the shade called Manifest from the Mikayla palette. There you go. Such a pretty shade. Oh my God, I'm in love. The next shade in the palette is called Slime, and this is being duped by the shade called Stunning from the Mikayla palette. This one, this beautiful chartreuse green shade. It's amazing. Wow. The next shade in the palette is called Macarena, and this is being duped by the shade called Abrazos from the Mariposa palette. It's like a burnt red shade. It's like a burnt red, like a rusty shade. Oh my god, those two shades together would be stunning. Look how beautiful that shade is. Wow. Impressed. Now the next shade in the palette is called Friends, and this is being duped by the shade called MJ from the Mikayla palette. I would say you would have to like mix MJ and part 2 together to get that shade. So let's do that. Yeah. Now the next shade in the palette is called Fanny Pack. And this is the shade that is being duped by the shade called Frisky. This beautiful deepening shade from the Mikayla palette. So let's swatch that. Those shades together are like absolutely magical. Love it. Now the last shade in that row is called Acid Wash, and this is being duped by the shade called Audrey from the Mikayla palette. This beautiful blue shade. I personally feel that Audrey is a little more on the deeper side and Acid Wash is a little more on the lighter tone, I would say. So do keep that in mind. This might not be like an exact dupe for the shade because this is a little more on the darker side, but I feel like if you like mix NARS or something like that together with Audrey, you can get like a similar shade. Actually, we should do that, right? Should I just mix a little bit of NARS? Yeah, look at that. Look at that. I am impressed. So that is the second row swatched out for you guys. Now let's move on to the third row. So the first shade in the palette is called Neon, and this is being duped by the shade called Iconic from the Mikayla palette, this hot pink shade. So let's swatch that. So that is duping the shade called Neon from the palette. The next shade in the palette is called Scrunchie, and this is being duped by the shade called Tequila from the Mariposa palette. You also have a shade called Champagne. Let me show it to you. From the Age of Opulance palette, which exactly dupes that shade too. This one. But I mean like Tequila shade is also like, when you swatch it, looks like super similar. So that is the second shade. And this dupes the shade Scrunchie from the palette. The next shade in the palette is called Big Hair, and this is being duped by the shade called Maria from the Mariposa palette. This one. I love this shade. Like for a deepening up shade, this is absolutely stunning. One of my favorite shade in that Mariposa palette. Look at that, how deep it goes. And this palette does have like a few deepening shades, like a right tone of the deepening shades. Love it. Now the next shade in the palette is called Shoulder Pads, and this is being duped by the shade called Lavish from the palette. This, I would say, it's more like an indigo shade, but also if you do not have or cannot find the Age of Opulance palette, because this is a limited edition palette, Mikayla palette also has a very similar shade, but this is like a true blue, I would say. This one, the last shade in the palette, it's called Mass Hole. So let me swatch Lavish for you guys. And that dupes the shade Shoulder Pads from the palette. The next shade in the palette is called Queen, and this is being duped by the shade called Simping from the Mikayla palette, this light pink shimmer shade. So let's swatch that. There you go. And the last shade in this row is called Boy Band, and this is being duped by the shade called Revival from the palette. Again, this is another blue shimmer shade that I feel like in the palette it is a little more on the lighter side, and this is more like punchy blue. There you go. And that is the third row swatched out for you guys. Now let's move on to the final row. Now the first shade in the last row is called Fashion, and this is being duped by the shade called Immaculate from the Mikayla palette. It's like a pinky purple shimmer shade, like a duochrome shade. Ignore the swatch marks if you can see any. I tried to remove it, but some of them are like super pigmented. Now the next shade in the palette is called Ninja Turtle, and this is being duped by the shade called Green Olive from the Dirty Martini palette. This one, this punchy green. Actually, Mikayla palette also has a shade, but that is a little more on the muted side, and it's called Loop. Let me show it to you guys. This one, but this is a little more on like the muted side. So I'm gonna swatch the Green Olive shade from the Dirty Martini palette. And that's the second shade that dupes the shade Ninja Turtle. The next shade in the palette is called Grungey, and this is also duped from the Dirty Martini palette, and the shade is called Extra Dirty. It's more of like a greeny brown shade, more of like a mossy green shade. So let me swatch that. Beautiful. The next shade in the palette is called Purple Rain, and this is being duped by this shade, a deep purple shimmer shade in the palette, and this is called Portagee from the Mikayla palette. Also, Age of Opulance also has a very similar shade, and that is called Ace from the palette. So let me swatch that. There you go. The next shade in the palette is called Mixtape, and this is being duped by the shade called Curfew from the Age of Opulance palette. And this is like a deep royal blue shade, like a navy blue, I would say. Beautiful shade. Look how deep that is. And the last shade of the palette is called Leg Warmers, and this is being duped by the shade called Rhodey, this sky blue shade from the Mikayla palette. So let's watch that. Look how pigmented that shade is. And that is the last row swatched for you guys. Now let me give you a close-up of all the swatches that I did for the entire palette so that you can see the whole palette in the entirety, and you can also see the dimension and the shifts that are there in the shades that I swatched for you guys in the outside lighting. And now once you've seen that, now let's move on to the two eye looks that I created using these dupe shades. I'm going to take the shade Hardy, this yellow shade, in the inner third of the eyelid. I'm going to concentrate it more towards the inner third. I'm only going to build it in the crease first. And then I'm going to take this olive shade, Green Olive, with the same brush. And I'm gonna blend it in the center of the crease. I basically want a gradient from yellow to green to a greeny brown. And then for the outer corners, I'm gonna dip into this shade, which is called Extra Dirty. See how it looks more brown in the pan, but on the eyes, it's more of like a, I would say like a mossy green shade. Just like that. Again, I'm going to take the same shade on the outer corners of my lower lash line. And go back to that Green Olive shade. Just blend around the edges. And I'm also going to take that on the lower lash line. Now for the lid shade, I'm going to dip into this shade, which is Stunning from the Mikayla palette. I'm going to concentrate that on the center of my eyelid. And for the inner corners, I'm going to dip into this shade, which is Champagne from the Age of Opulance palette. I'm going to take the same shade on my inner corners too. And just flick it out to meet the inner third of the eye. Just like that. Now let me finish off this eye with some liner and mascara, and I'll get right back. Now for the lower lash line, I'm going to take this shade, which is Abrazos from the Mariposa palette. And I'm basically going to tight line my lower lash line. I'm going to take a tiny little bit of Abrazos, and then I'm just going to melt it right in the center of that dark green shade and that lid shade. I'm going to go back to that Stunning shade from the Mikayla palette and just run it at the edges, just so that there's no harsh lines. Love that, love that. Okay, this is my first eye look. Now let's move on to the second eye look. I'm first going to take Simba from the Mikayla palette and I'm going to blend that into my crease. Now once we have all that in the crease, I'm going to take the same shade on my lower lash line too. Okay, now I'm going to dip into this shade, which is iconic, the hot pink shade in the palette. I'm going to concentrate that on the inner third of the eyelid and then blend it into that Simba shade. And now I'm going to take this shade, which is Frisky from the palette, and then blend that to the center of my eyelid. And then finally, I'm going to take this shade, Maria from the Mariposa palette. I'm going to take the same shade on the outer corners of my lower lash line. I'm going to go back to that Frisky shade and then just blend the edges. I'm going to take this shade, How You Doin', and just blend underneath the brows so that there's no harsh lines. Now I'm going to dip into this shade, Nube from the palette, and place it right on the center of my eyelid. I'm going to dip into this Immaculate shade, apply that on the eyelid, and then dipping into the Simping shade right in the inner corners and then flicking it out to the inner third of the eyelid, just like that. For the lower lash line, I'm going to take this shade Frisky and then just tight line on the lower lash line. I'm going to finish my eyes with some liner and mascara and I'll get right back with the final look. And that's my second look. I really hope that you guys enjoyed both the eye looks that I created for you guys. And let me know in the comment section below, are you interested in picking up this palette or do you already have these palettes already in your collection so that you can dupe these shades? Now you know what to do. If you did like this video, do give it a thumbs up. Also do subscribe to my channel before you leave and also ring that notification bell so that you're notified every time that I post next. I generally upload 3 videos every single week, every Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays at 9 AM Eastern Standard Time. Until next time, I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye guys.